Hello and let's talk about Delhi. The capital of India has seen protests for over 2 months, but the last 2 days have seen unprecedented communal violence, perhaps the worst in decades. Latest estimates say that up to 7 people have died. Disturbing images and videos are emerging of people being beaten up by angry mobs, vehicles being torched and people shouting provocative and violent slogans. On Tuesday, that's today, the state machinery finally responded. There were meetings and calls for peace, which are definitely important. However, a key question before all of us today is what led to this? After all these months of peaceful protests, why did the clashes break out over the past 2 days? Before we discuss this further, here are some facts for your consideration. On Saturday, BJP leader Kapil Mishra made some provocative statements while leading a pro-CAA mob in Mojpur Chowk. The DCP of the Northeast Delhi was alongside him, and Kapil Mishra said, he gave a 3-day ultimatum to Delhi police to clear roads in Jafrabad and Chandbagh. His exact statements were, I am making one thing clear on all of our behalf. We will hold our peace until Trump leaves. After that, if roads are not cleared out, we won't even listen to you. He was referring to the police. Yesterday, the media reported that right-wing groups had mobilized in many locations in Northeast Delhi. The members of these groups were wielding hockey sticks, lathis and other weapons. Some of the places where the violence occurred were Mojpur, Jafrabad, Chandbagh, Kardampuri, Bhajanpura, Gogulpuri and Noor-e-Ilahi. Over 100 people have been injured so far, with some media reports putting the number as high as close to 150. On Monday, many neighborhoods saw heavy stone pelting between protesters opposing and supporting the CAA. In many of the locations mentioned above, the police resorted to bait and charges and fired tear gas shells. Section 144 of the CRPC was imposed, prohibiting the gathering of people. At least 10 shops in Mojpur and 2 in Karawal Nagar and a petrol pump were burned by rioters. A number of shops, mainly belonging to the minority community, were vandalized in Mojpur, which was the epicenter of the riots. Reports suggest that at least 30 vehicles were torched on Tuesday morning also, along with a few shops. Residents allege that the police were present when the mobs indulged in arson, but did not act. On Tuesday, Chief Minister Arvind Kejriwal chaired a meeting with key officials and made an appeal for peace at a press conference. Home Minister Amit Shah also convened a meeting with Kejriwal, the Lieutenant Governor, and top police officials and representatives of political parties. The participants agreed on the need to establish peace and also proposed concrete measures for the same, including the formation of peace committees and better coordination between police and the MLAs. To discuss more about this, we have with us Sonali. Sonali, thank you for joining us. So you've been on the ground for the past few days actually, and the situation is still developing because there are reports of violence happening even now.
Yeah.
But from media reports and from our own reporting, we do get a larger idea, a larger picture, where it's clear that this has become a very communal situation and that this actually suits the interest, of course, of certain sections. But what kind of processes on the ground do you see that have led to this situation?
See, like you said in your intro as well, that for the past 2 months there have been protests where a huge number of people have gathered against the CAA. So, but even in all that, you see, they were peaceful. People, protesters and people who were supporting the protest, they all made sure that the protests were peaceful. Not a single person could say any inflammatory statement or anything. But ever since, like in the Delhi elections also, you saw like there were certain
lone gunmen.
There were certain incidents where like in Shaheen Bagh, a guy wielding a gun came and he fired, and same happened in Jamia as well. So you see, this is not an isolated incident. We don't need to like have to see it like, you know, this just started happening from Sunday or Monday. This has been happening from 2 months. Even though we were like, when we were, since we've been covering the protest, anti-CAA protest, we could see certain people being very agitated towards these protests. They were very frustrated that the police was not doing anything or the politicians were not doing anything to clear the roads or whatever. So this is not just something spontaneously happened on Sunday or on Monday. These this hatred. They have been fueling this hatred since past 2 months, and suddenly, yes, it did erupt with Kapil Mishra. I was there actually when he came to Mojpur Chowk, and it was just it started with some 50 people, and soon it became like some 200 people who blocked that road. And he was there, he was still making inflammatory statements there, and the people who were gathered, they were sloganeering very inflammatory things. And I've also seen like a similar protest happened near Shaheen Bagh last month. I was there as well, and the slogans were the same. They were saying like they were provoking the Delhi police to have like do a crackdown on the protesters. Just do anything, and that anything includes violence. For Delhi police, they were provoking the Delhi police to just clear the road because that's what they wanted, and this is what's happening, and they don't care that the whole city is burning because of them.
And a look at any history of riots in India shows that it's never spontaneous, like you said. There's always definitely an organized element. So when people say riots or clashes, what we often ignore is that there is definitely a very concerted attempt made to provoke all sides, basically. Concerted attempt made to provoke not only the police, as you were pointing out, but even, say, other sections of protesters to make sure that there is violence. And then it can be justified saying it's from both sides.
Yeah. So even here, we are not saying that this is a one-sided violence. There is violence from both sides. But you have to see how it became violent, because they have been protesting for last 2 months and it was very peaceful, and it wasn't just 100 people protesting, it was like thousands of people gathered, and the protesters themselves making sure that no unfortunate thing happens in the protest or near the area. They were making sure security checks and everything was done.
And even the messaging, there was a lot of focus on communal harmony, on the unity of the country, the integrity of the constitution being the grounds on which those protests were happening.
True. And in fact, that's a very interesting aspect of this. When you go to any anti-CAA protest, the flags you see there are always Indian flag. But I've seen a couple of pro-CAA or anti these protests, you always see a Bhagwa flag there.
Right. So, as in it's more, what do you call it? It's less focused on that kind of this thing, clearly. So, what the state administration has now made a pitch for peace. Not only the state administration, even the centre is appearing to, although at least one union minister has made provocative statements. But nonetheless, the government has called peace meetings. There's been some focus on, say, building community participation, like we said, local peace committees, more coordination. But it does definitely seem that unless, say, the state government itself is sort of not really in a position to do much. So how do you evaluate the possibility of these actions actually working?
Yeah. So first of all, the thing is, Delhi, like police and law and order is under the center. They have to do something. And the second thing is, until they stop their own people, Kapil Mishra is not some random person who comes out and says things. He's a BJP member. Unless they stop these people from making inflammatory statements, this is not going to end. If they don't do that, then this is just tokenism.
Right, exactly. Thank you so much, Sonali. And now we have a video from Karwa-e-Mohabbat appealing for peace.
डीसीपी साहब हमारे सामने खड़े हैं। मैं आप सबके बिहाफ पे ये बात कह रहा हूँ, ट्रंप के जाने तक तो हम शांति से जा रहे हैं, लेकिन उसके बाद हम आपकी भी नहीं सुनेंगे अगर रास्ते खाली नहीं हुए तो। ठीक है।
Our second story is about the visit of US President Donald Trump to India. Today is the last day of his visit, and one of the key agreements that is going to happen is on the purchase of defense helicopters from the US by India. To talk more about this, we have with us Prabir Purkayastha. Prabir, so yesterday in Donald Trump's speech, he once again highlighted the fact that India was going to purchase the 24 helicopters, the Seahawk helicopters. And one of the things he said was that the US is hoping to be India's leading defense partner. So to start with, what do you think are the implications of this?
Well, let's put it this way, that the US is trying to displace the Russians,
Right,
who are still our major weapon suppliers. And the United States has not been very happy with the fact that India still maintains a relationship on military supplies from Russia.
Right.
We have the S-400s, which are for its class of weapons or defense weapons, the best in the world. So it's not surprising that India has done that, or the nuclear submarine,
Right.
and so on. So these are all things which the United States is not happy about, particularly the S-400s. So India, given the fact, wants to be closer to the United States in strategic terms, particularly because India would like to think it's a counterweight to China. And as we know, it's really a difficult task given the fact that the Chinese economy is growing and is a much bigger economy as of now. So this is really a difficult task, but that's India's vision at least. So India has been coming closer to the United States, particularly in what's called the Indo-Pacific region. Now, there isn't much new that's happening as yet. So one of the things that we seem to be doing is to come closer on what's called the foundation agreements, defense agreements. Right. There are a lot of 4-letter, 5-letter words here. I'm not going into that. The last is the BECA, which is something which if we sign, then we get into the communication geospatial coordinates will be coordinated. We get much tighter into the embrace of the United States' larger strategic objective. So that's also under discussion. We talked about the helicopter deal. This has been in the offing for some time. And India has been balancing buying weapons as well as aircraft or helicopters from Russia, and also buying them from the United States, in some sense trying to even the plate.
Right.
And in this particular case, 2.6 billion Seahawk helicopters. And there is also a possibility of 6 other Apache helicopters, which also India has apparently given an assurance it will buy. So that's why people are talking of a $3 billion deal. One important part of all of this, and I think that's something we really don't know, is that the United States insists that the communications, the intelligence on board of the equipment, the supply, should all be integrated with the United States Armed Forces as well. Right. Now that would mean that increasingly the Indians would have different kinds of equipment which matches with the United States, certain others which will not. And this means this hybrid kind of defense means, will India be really in control of a part of its armed forces if it's integrated with the United States, for example? Will it recognize as friend, say, the helicopters we buy from the Russians? Right. There is an argument that the mishap that happened over Kashmir during the Balakot, post-Balakot the incident, that when we were doing the strategic surgical strike inside, then there was, as you know, a helicopter which was shot down, which is a Russian-made helicopter. And one of the arguments is because the American-made defense equipment did not recognize it as a friend. Right. So will it recognize Pakistan equipment as friend, which is integrated with the American defense forces? Will it recognize Russians as only enemies? So those are the questions we still have to resolve. And this is one of the reasons a lot of the Indian defense establishment has been very wary of this 4 so-called foundation, 4 or 5 foundation agreements, which integrates all of Indian defense equipment, which are purchased from the United States with the United States military forces. So those are the kind of questions we still have with the foundation agreements and the kind of defense equipment we buy from the US. What is the control we have over it? Because as you know, a lot of it is really today intelligent systems. And without that, you don't really control your own equipment.
Right. So, like you mentioned, the US is also a major supplier to Pakistan. So, it's kind of ironic that considering India's foreign policy these days is so centered on Pakistan, we're both buying from the same source. But is this also maybe an attempt to sort of say, try to get to pressurize the US into taking a more, not neutral maybe, but a more harsher stand on Pakistan, and will it even work?
Well, you know, Trump has made some notional statements about Pakistan, terrorism and so on. Trump is very transactional. He'll make any statement you want because talk is cheap as long as you buy equipment from the United States. So we've got one statement about Pakistan spending $3 billion. I will say it's a rather expensive buy, okay? But there's the other part of it, which is a part of also, shall we say, the larger optics of the situation. Here is Trump in his own view, and it seems in the view of the Indian establishment, overlord of the world. So he has come to Motera Stadium. We have given him 100,000 people in the stadium. We have also given him, I don't know, unnamed number of people lining the roads. So we have treated him as an overlord should be treated.
Right.
He has in turn said Modi is a good guy. He has blessed Modi. And we have also
even in the Sabarmati Ashram register.
And we have then sweetened the pile, sweetened this whole deal, the fact that he's come all the way for 2 days by giving him a $3 billion gift. You know, when the George V had his coronation in India, all the princes came with gifts. So I'm sure the optics of this, the Motera Stadium, 100,000 people, the gift of $3 billion helicopter deal, is not being lost on the world. And as again, talk is cheap, he is also a Christian. Mr. Trump is Christian Modi, the father of the nation. So I'm sure that Indian people will remember we already have a father of the nation, and getting two fathers is difficult.
Right. And one key aspect the government has been talking about with respect, especially to the helicopters, is that they're anti-submarine helicopters. So there's this argument that India is now capable of increased force projection, especially against Pakistan and also China. But do you think these kind of agreements do in any way help India to actually extend its sphere of influence and its approach to China, basically?
You know, this whole concept of force projection is something which is, I will say, anachronistic. Because today, offensive capabilities are cheap. You have cheap drones, you have cheap cruise missiles, you have underwater drone stroke equivalent to cruise missiles. So all of this means that force projection of the 19th century, when you send warships abroad, and then following up in the 20th century, we had this aircraft carriers, which are really floating fortresses.
Right.
And that's what force projection was. So you had a triad, submarines, aircraft carriers. So this is, we have seen, is something which is increasingly becoming outmoded in strategic terms. We have written about this a number of times in NewsClick, that once you have intelligent offensive weapons, even cheap ones armed with this ability can actually defend not only what your shoreline is, but also inflict damage to extremely extremely expensive equipment,
right,
which belong to the 20th century. So the whole concept of strategic parity is not to have the same weapons, but what is it that you can do? And increasingly now, with intelligence mounted on the devices, offensive weapons are cheap, and they have the strike capabilities of a kind which defeats force projection concepts.
Right.
So if we are going to force project against China, even the United States today accepts that near China and in the sea, the ocean borders or the ocean zone near Chinese shoreline, there is no force projection even the United States can do.
Right.
The United States is not able to do force projection against North Korea and Iran successfully as of now. So I think this concept of India doing force projection is a 20th century vision of strategic understanding, and it doesn't fit in with today's reality.
Right. Thank you so much, Prabir. That's all we have time for in this episode of Let's Talk. We'll be back tomorrow at 3 p.m. with the major news developments of the day. Until then, keep watching NewsClick.